Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our talk today, or our conversation, and we hope you too will be part of our conversation. I'm Jill Hartz, Executive Director of the museum, and it is a pleasure to have with us today two good friends and people that I'm just thrilled are here to share their experiences that are relevant to our theme today. Lenny Campello, who's right here next to me, and next to him is Darrel Couturier. And we'll start the program formally in just a minute, but I'm also thrilled to have Carlos Aguirre here today, because I don't think any of this would have happened without first learning that Carlos teaches a course in history, and Carlos, as many of you know, is also director of the Latin American Studies program. But he teaches a course that looks at Che and his influence, both as an icon and revolutions in Latin America. And that fitted in really well with this offer from Lenny, who has a collector who had these Korda pictures. And it was like, well, maybe we can make this marriage happen. And then that happened at the same time that we were beginning our second round of academic support grants. So we have this wonderful new program that started last year where we invited the College of Arts and Sciences and the School of Architecture and Allied Arts, and this year the Honors College, to join with us in providing funds that we hoped and were matched by the provost, that we could then invite faculty in those schools to write grants, write applications for grants, not huge grants, but grants that would make the museum a site of learning for their courses and research. And we're thrilled with the great response we received from that, and also thrilled that the funds that came through that enabled us to cover costs of shipping the work and bringing these two wonderful gentlemen here. So if any of you are faculty in the audience and have not known about our program, come and talk to me or look it up on the website. But we basically want to make the museum indispensable to everyone on campus. So this seems to be a good program that's working. But also I wanted to let you know that Carlos will be giving a talk and called Che Guevara, The Man Behind the Myth, and that's on Saturday, November 23rd at 2 p.m. So make sure you come back for that. And I also want to say that you probably can't ignore the surveys that are on your table. Twice a year we try and do these surveys, which really give us a baseline of who's visiting and how well we're doing. But it's useful for grant applications, for our programming, for all kinds of things. And I know that Sharon in the back of the room has little treats for you. So if you fill this out today, then go back and ask her for something, because I think you'll be pleased with what she'll give you. So I think that's all the beginning remarks. So we're going to start off with questions, or at least my questions, for both of them, and then open this up. And some of these questions will be accompanied by images. We've mushed their two PowerPoints together, so we're going to go through images and have a general conversation. And I know some of the questions will bring in answers that I already know but are wonderful, and others will be big surprises. But what I thought we'd start off with, and not for the whole time, but maybe for 5 minutes or so each, is to talk about why you're interested in Cuban Latin American art, how you got to that point, how you got to be gallerists, and you've probably always been an artist, so that's a hard question that I won't ask you. And also you need to see Lenny's work that's in our Schnitzer gallery if you haven't as well, which relates to this theme. But Lenny, let me start with you of some of your background so that I'm not presenting that.
Thank you. 5 minutes. Giving a microphone to a Cuban and asking him to talk for 5 minutes is a tough thing, so I will try. I was born in Santiago de Cuba, although I was raised in Guantanamo, and my father was in the Cuban Revolution, and like most of those guys that were fighting, he's in exile now. The other day, he's 90 years old. My mother's 91. The other day, my mother asked him in their own special thing, when the heck are you going to die? And he responded, I'm not dying until I can go back to Cuba to die. So my father fought alongside Che during the Cuban Revolution, and very early after the revolution ended, he wasn't a communist like most of those people were. So we all ended in exile. They came here, always think that they were going to go back, which is a common thread in the Cuban diaspora. So I was always hearing about Che and about the revolution when I was a kid. I was always an artist, you're right. My grandmother used to give me a quarter for drawings. So that was an incentive. I was not gonna mention this since I'm in Oregon, but I studied art at the University of Washington. Back in those days, we always used to have duck for dinner and football, not anymore. And Che and some other icons have always sort of been part of my artwork. I'm naturally a storyteller, just like my dad was. I like to tell stories. The piece that I have upstairs, which I'll be talking about later, it works along those lines. While I was at Washington, I used to sell. I used to have all my assignments. Once they were graded, they were up for sale at the Pike Place Market. Everything was up for sale, and there's hundreds and hundreds of Campellos that were sold for $5, $10, $15, $20 in those days. And that kindled it. I opened a gallery in Washington, D.C. in 1996, a second one in Bethesda, Maryland in 2001. And I became more interested. Those galleries were never, ever aimed or focused on Cuban art. I also used to write a lot about art. I still do. And I was invited, I received an email in 2000 from the Havana Hebrew Community Center. They were trying to raise funds for a toilet in a new gallery they were doing. So I decided to do a Cuban art show to raise funds for them. And it was the first time I'd sort of been in contact with Cuban artists. And the rest from there is history. I still represent some of those and have become really, really good friends with some of them.
I won't go back to birth, but that's where I think my interest in art sort of began. I grew up in a gallery business back in first. It started in New York City, and then when we moved to Connecticut in '61, the gallery ended up there. My mother opened the gallery, and in the '60s and '70s, she represented quite a number of Latin American artists because it was at a time when many Latin Americans, especially from South America, came to New York for because of political situations in their countries, and were trying to find representation in galleries in New York, which was very difficult at the time because the thinking was, how could an artist from third world country produce anything new? It's kind of arrogant, and especially considering that there was an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in the early '70s, the title of which was 30 Centuries of Mexican Art. Not 30 years, 30 centuries. So, my first real connection with Cuba happened in 1971. I lived in Puerto Rico for 5 years, and half my friends were Cuban, who had pretty recently moved because of the revolution to Cuba, fled Cuba, moved to Puerto Rico from Cuba. And I had gone to New York for a long weekend, and on the flight back, some drunk Puerto Rican hijacked the plane, and we ended up in Havana for 3 days. So that was my first view of Havana. What was extraordinary was that all my Cuban friends in Puerto Rico were telling me about Cuba like it was this paradise. And I said, yeah, I understand. I come from a family of refugees also, European, German Jews. And the memory of the homeland is always bigger than it really is. But when I arrived there that night in '71, I said, they forgot just how grand this is. They built Paris in the Caribbean. It didn't make any sense. And I didn't return until '97, about 26 years later, to the biennial to see what was happening in contemporary art in Cuba. When I saw what I saw, I was amazed at the vibrancy of the contemporary art movement in Cuba. And that day, that was the first day there, I decided that I was going to make it a program to bring all these artists to the gallery in Los Angeles, which I opened in 1987. And I made about 43 studio visits that first week. They were long days, but it had to be done because nobody was doing it, and it was also the time to be able to do it. I got to work with Alberto Korda and represent him, and I gave him his first exhibition in the United States because I met him at a close friend of mine's home, and I knew his work, as a child because they were published in Life and Look magazines. And I asked him, have you ever had an exhibition in the US? He said, no. I said, why not? He said, nobody ever asked me. I said, well, I'm asking. He said, come see me on Thursday. It was that easy, but you just have to be there and I guess make the gesture. And the rest, I guess they say, is sort of history.
Sort of history, but when you look at how many galleries are no longer around, I think you two have the magic touch in some ways. So the works in this exhibition all come from one private collection of Dr. Steve and Roberta Pechenik. So I'm curious to know who they are or why they would be collecting Kordas and how you got to know them.
Dr. Pechenik, Steve Pechenik, is a Cuban-born Cuban-American who currently is retired, lives in Miami Beach. Like many Cubans, he arrived here with nothing, very little money. And he's written 66 books, 39 bestsellers, was Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for George Bush I. He's produced a ton of movies, so he's a very successful character. I met him in the very first Cuban art exhibition that I referenced before. I was sitting in my gallery on a Sunday. We're across the courtyard from a breakfast restaurant. He walks in with his wife and mother-in-law complaining about the price of pancakes and then proceeded to buy the entire show just to support this is a gallerist's fantasy come through, right? So then over the years we became friends. He always bought work by dissident Russian and dissident Chinese and dissident Cuban artists and Cuban art that he liked, and always been very generous in donating a lot of artwork. He was also, I forgot to mention this, an incredible part. Every time I mention it, he managed to go to Yale and Harvard at the same time and get degrees from both. So the guy is absolutely amazing. His wife, Bertie Pechenik, is also a PhD. He used to be a professor at Northwestern and also has her own angle of collecting and an amazing supporter to the arts in the Washington, D.C. region. Oh, they acquired the work. They acquired this collection of Korda photographs directly from Korda's daughter very soon after Korda died. I talked to him. I knew Jill's interest in Cuban art and all that. So it all came together with with Professor Aguirre's class, and they're very, very glad that that's here.
So one of the reasons we are here is really because of this iconic image of Che by Korda. And I know that, I don't know, we're going to deviate sometimes from this because I think the history of this image itself is really important. The fact that it wasn't immediately known as an iconic image and came about. So I don't know, one or the other of you want to talk about the circumstances in which the image was taken?
Sure. Maybe I'll address that because I also did a documentary film with a friend of mine, Trisha Ziff, who directed and produced a film called Chevolution, which is available on Netflix, which, by the way, is the first and last film that Netflix funded. Yeah, I will. I just have to. I didn't put these images in any order because I didn't know exactly where we were going to be headed. This is actually just a photograph. Oh, by the way, the documentary film is about the history of that one iconic image, which has a very fascinating history from the moment it was taken to what it's become, what it means today. This is Alberto Korda in 1998 in his very simple apartment in a section of Havana called Miramar. And of course, he has a print of the image behind him. I show this only because so often the artists or authors are rarely ever shown. You always see their work. And I'm really very interested in the person, too. Just like the revolution was supposedly a humanist revolution, something that Korda addressed in most of his work and was very conscious of. I think important to see the people. This is the contact sheet from the roll of film that Korda took that day at a funeral on March the 5th in 1960. The funeral was held in front of the cemetery Colón in Havana, in a section of Havana called Vedado, because 2 days before, a ship bearing arms for the revolution from Belgium exploded somehow mysteriously in the harbor, Havana harbor, killing some 140 people. And Fidel was giving the eulogy outside of the entrance of the Cementerio Colón. And Korda was there as a reporter for the only newspaper at the time called La Revolución. Today it's known as Gramma. And you'll see in most of the images is Fidel, and next to Fidel were Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre had come there, this is in 1960, to do research for a book on the revolution, which he published, I think, under the name of Sugar Hurricane. It was raining that day, a light rain, and Korda had a Leica camera in his hand, and Che did not like to stand in the front of the tribunal at all. He was standing in the second or third row. And all of a sudden, in just a split moment, he came forward. There were thousands of people in the street looking up at the platform that had been erected where Fidel and the rest of them were standing, and Che looked out at all the people. And you'll see the two frames that he took that day towards the bottom center. Well, he went back to his studio and printed it, hoping that that image of Che would be used in the newspaper the next day reporting the funeral, which it was not. They printed a photo of, I think, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre and Fidel. By the way, at that eulogy was the first time the phrase, popular in Cuba today, is patria o muerte, country or death, was mentioned in his speech. The print you see on the right is the very first print that he printed that day. And it's important because 7 years later, in 1967, there was an Italian journalist by the name of Feltrinelli who had a left-wing publishing house in Milan, Italy, was in Cuba for a international book festival, and was looking for an image of Che to publish. He was sent to Korda's studio because somebody knew that Korda had images of Che. And Korda pointed to that image there, and Feltrinelli said, "Yes, I like that." And so he said, "Come back the next day," and Korda gave him 2 prints. My thinking now, this is not the first time that this image will have been published anywhere. Feltrinelli in 1967, Che was assassinated October of 67. This is the portrait that is known, is world known. Just bear with me 1 second. I want to find the poster, which I thought I had reproduced here. But what's important is that in 1967, after Che died, you had some social political events happening in Europe. There was demonstrations at the Sorbonne University. There was then, following year, there were in 68. In Italy, you had demonstrations and protests in the streets, and all of them used this image in protest because Feltrinelli published several 100,000 posters with this image on it. And at the bottom, he had put copyright Feltrinelli. Korda's name was never mentioned. Nobody knew who the photographer was until 1980. So Korda never got anything, no rights. In the meantime, before Che died in 1967, August of 67, in Paris Match, there appears this image, and also another image, some demonstration in Cuba and the Revolutionary Square, Plaza de la Revolución, and people there are already brandishing the poster in their hands. So what we still have not been able to figure out is why and who in Cuba already took this image as being an important image, important enough to put it on a placard. I know from a very well-known photographer, Roberto Salas, in Cuba, that he had seen this image already in Vietnam in 1965. So the image had been traveling and circulating. How it got there, nobody knows. Our suspicion is that Jean-Paul Sartre, in 1960, and Korda traveled throughout the island. They spent about 2-3 weeks traveling. And my suspicion is that he was given a copy of this image, because I also read somewhere that Jean-Paul Sartre had informed somebody in 1962 or 63 of the existence of this image, because he had seen it, so he might have had a copy. These are all things for other people to research and find out. Why this image? Why did it become so popular? If you look at it, you have a very handsome man, for one. Number two, there's no background, so he's totally out of context. He's not in any particular location. He's not associated with any particular time. He's got wild hair. He's got a beret with a star on it, and the star symbolizes all kinds of things. It was an era also with the idea of stardom, and Hollywood was also a very popular motif. So it was the perfect image, because it's not the only image of Che Guevara to exist. There certainly are there are others that were taken by other very famous photographers, and here are three. You have a very famous image on the top left of Osvaldo Salas. You have a very famous image on the top right of René Bury, and then on the bottom of Real Guevara. But you could see it's kind of problematic for maybe those images to become famous or icons. Well, first off, they're all smoking images. Well, in those days, nobody really cared, but there's something just not there, no? It went on then to become an image that was people appropriated for their own use, to mean all kinds of other things. Just let me see if I can find. This is how Korda. These are not sort of done for decoration. The darkroom, Jose Figueroa, who was his assistant, printed for Korda a lot of times. And he had just printed a whole bunch of these, because every time Korda traveled, he would take unsigned photographs with him. And Figueroa would print them. His darkroom was to the right, and lay them on his bed to dry. And then give them to Korda, who would take them. And he would only sign them as he either sold them or gave them away. Because Korda always said, if you ever see a photograph of mine that's not signed, it's not mine. So, I think that'll give you a little background.
Right. Okay, so it's for you. But so Darrel's kind of indicated why this might be an iconic image. But I guess it's been appropriated not just for political purposes. It's probably the most, or one of the most reproduced images in the world.
Image in the history of photography, and this is just a tiny little sampling,
right?
Because we did a museum exhibition with had 300 and some odd examples of its use, but there are far many more.
Right. So I'm wondering if you could speak about that, Lenny, about its appropriation and its use, and even for those who may not, be ideologically in line with the revolution, that this image seems to be used in different ways, and even how it's inspired you.
Oh, yes, the image, I think, has been used by both those that idolize Che and those that despise him. Before I get to that, when he said Patria o Muerte venceremos, it triggered a memory from my childhood. As little kids in Guantanamo, we used to say, and unfortunately only if you speak Spanish, because I'm not going to say this in English, we used to say, Patria o Muerte venceremos, y si llegan los americanos, nos cagaremos. So the photograph, without a doubt, has been sort of used by both the right and the left. If you just Google this image and drop it in Google, you'll find all kinds of T-shirt. I have a piece that I call T-shirt God, and it's in Latin. It was really difficult to find a Latin word for T-shirt, so I'm using tunic. But and so you see it with Che, instead of the saying revolución or whatever, or Che, it says comunista come mierda, which is another Cuban curse word, which I'm also not going to repeat, with the stop sign on it, the pro, the con. I have a particular empirical exercise that I've been doing for years and years and years, and it's decreasing. And that particular exercise, this guy who did this T-shirt, I think exemplified the best. every time I see somebody wearing a Che Guevara T-shirt, I ask them, "Do you know who that is?" When the opportunity arises. Someone came up with this T-shirt. when I started doing my own artwork about Che, and I started really, really young, and I've done him many, many, many times over. He's one of my iconic sort of series. I expressly did not want to use this image. So later on, when we start discussing my work, you'll see that I've used other images. The one upstairs, I completely devised out of my head, although I worked on it in several iterations, just on purpose. So that, and it wasn't some sort of moral thing that I had about appropriating Korda's photograph. Back in those days, another joke was that every Cuban photographer was named Archivo, which means archive, because no one was allowed to have any private property. So there's no private property, then this photograph is available to anybody who wants to use it. Who knows? That might have been a reason why it's been propagated. And I would challenge, I saw upstairs that this is the second most reproduced art image. I would challenge the fact that the Mona Lisa has been reproduced more than this. Because, you know, if you start, not just T-shirts, if you start talking about, I've seen it in cigarette brands in Europe. I've seen it in, there was the whole issue with liquor. I mean, and if you go to eBay right now, you see it in pins. And the fact that it's in the $3 bill, right? In Cuba alone, that alone seems to imply to me that the image is probably hitting some pretty high numbers compared to Mona Lisa.
Okay. All right. And we will get back to your work soon. So Korda wasn't always a photographer of the revolution. He had a long history before that. And I'm wondering how his earlier work can influenced the images he made later. This is a two-parter. That's the first part. And the second part is, did it bother him, or did it affect his own work in some way to have an image like Che that took on a life of its own so much?
Well, to begin, the first part, Korda in the 50s was a very famous commercial and fashion photographer in Cuba. In fact, I think he opened his studio Korda in 1954, and his real name is Alberto Diaz. But Diaz is a very common name in Cuba, and he was trying to find a name for the studio that would have a little more cachet. So he and his studio partner then, Luis, went to the movies, and they saw a film directed by the Hungarian film director Alexander Korda. And Korda liked the name because it sounded like Kodak, which was the only film sold in Cuba at the time. So he called it his studio, Studio Korda. But people started calling him Korda. So you always see in the signature, you can see them on the photos upstairs, the top says Alberto Diaz, and underneath it, Korda. He was photographing fashion models. He was photographing movie stars. He was also sent out to do commercial shoots. One of the last that he did, which created, from which this image comes from, he was sent out by the Cuba Tourist Board in February of 1959 for a campaign, and came to this girl's house in Pinar del Rio, which is outside of Havana in the sort of tobacco-growing region of Cuba, and took this girl's picture, but she was frightened by the camera and backed up in the corner of her house, and the wood she's holding was her doll. It was a log. She said, don't cry, my baby," and she was crying. And Korda says that when he developed that night, this image, that he realized that he could not continue doing all this commercial and frivolous work and had to dedicate himself to the revolution. This was the transitional image in his life and in his work. And because of where he came from in his history as a photographer of beauty and of models, you will see in almost all his photographs of the revolution, you'll see in almost all the photographs upstairs, that they're very humanist, not necessarily posed, but he was very careful to wait for positions to show the humanity of the people. And it was because of his photographs that I think the world got a view of the Cuban Revolution as a more humanitarian revolution. Yes, there was a lot of bloodshed. Yes, there were a lot of people were killed, people fled in droves. So it was in conflict in a way with reality. But what the world saw were his photos.
So I wanted to ask you about your own work at this point, Lenny, and then we can go back to other kinds of the influence maybe of Korda on artists. But you have a work upstairs, Sanctus Guevara's Castrum Canis. I'm probably not saying that right, but is that okay? Which some of you get. So perhaps, could you talk about its double nature?
Yes. So really quickly, sort of leading a little bit to that piece. This piece, by the way, which is fairly large, is about maybe 5 feet long. It's also in the collection of Dr. Pechenik. Predates that the Sanctus Guevara's Castrum Canis. And this is a play on Cuban speech. Jacobo Timerman, the Argentinian writer, once wrote that Cubans use Spanish as a weapon. The first word there, acere, is a Cuban street slang word that means friend. And then si means yes, no means no. So here is an image that I can't remember the name of the photographer that was appropriated from a photograph of Che. And then the poster behind him reads acere, sí o no, which in Cuban, not Spanish, in Cuban would say something like, friend, yes or no. The highlighted words answer the question, and they spell asesino, assassin. I'm sort of making a political statement in there of my own. Cubans got this when it was shown at the art fairs in Miami. Nobody else did. That was actually this lower one was a lower version. I always try to juxtapose the physical beauty of Guevara. Then I worked on this piece pretty much about the same year. It's maybe a little bit hard to sell. And that came from a book that I read, and then I met the writer of a Cuban-American CIA agent named Felix Rodriguez, who was the guy who hunted down Che in Bolivia and helped to, and he wrote a book about the whole thing. And in the book, he claims that the Cuban G2 was actually providing the CIA via the Bolivian Communist Party the coordinates of where Che was. Nobody believed them at the time when the book came out in the mid-1990s, late 1990s. But then the curious thing happened that when the Cuban lieutenants that Che took with him to Bolivia were released after they finished their 20-year sentence or 25-year sentence, and they returned to Cuba, they were immediately arrested and put in jail, which is an interesting thing, at least to me. So that gave some evidence maybe that Castro or the Cuban G2 was in fact providing the CIA through the Bolivian Communist Party, which has location and coordinates. That nobody will know that except the people who were involved. So this piece says, finalmente denunciamos al que traicionó al Che. Finally will denounce he who betrayed Che. And all the big words spell Fidel. Again, that was difficult. This was a very original piece of the first drawing where I was trying to work on creating a new Che from scratch that was in some way, manner, or form different from appropriating or using Korda's photograph. This piece now hangs in the collection of the head of a very large American union who is an avowed communist, and he thinks that he owns a pro-Che piece, so I laugh behind his back because it really isn't. If you could only speak Latin, because there's no writing on it, but it's titled on the back the same way. This was a second version. This is owned by a British art collector. Same thing. I actually explained to him the whole relationship that I was trying to achieve with the photograph. I mean, with the drawing, and he bought it nonetheless. This it's a small piece that I did also in the process of doing this, where I'm using kind of the curling in Che's hair. I was toying with the idea of giving his hair curls a little bit of horns, but it was a little bit heavy-handed in my opinion. I still managed to sell the drawing, so that's good. And this is the piece that's upstairs in the first stage. I actually did the piece. There's a video that plays in the heart. The video starts with a very beautiful Che delivering a speech, and it fades into a live execution that took place in La Cabaña, which is one of the castles in Havana Harbor, where all of the executions took place. Che was in charge. Che was the chief execution officer, if you call it, for the Cuban Revolution. He wrote in his diaries that Cubans didn't have the cojones to do it, so he had to do it. Those are his own words, paraphrased a little. So Cubans used to call him el chacal de la cabaña, the jackal of the La Cabaña. La Cabaña is the fortress. So remember this, because this plays a key part. I had this framed and all that, and then I hung it, and then something was missing, so I had it completely unframed. And this is it laying in my studio, and I wrote what the title that was in my head, Sanctos Guevara's Castrum Canis. It's a play on word, and it's kind of, this is the heart, this is where the video plays, the Catholic heart. This is a little bit a shot of one of the videos. This is him giving a speech at the Punta del Este in Uruguay in 1960, I believe. And then that dissolves into the execution, a live execution. So, the play on words, Santos Guevara is Holy Guevara or Saint Guevara, okay? And that's for the people, who, in my mind, who idealize Che and they view him as a saint. Castrum Canis. Castrum in Latin means castle. It's also the Latinized form of Castro. So it's both things. Remember that. So La Cabaña is a castle. And there's no Latin word that I'm aware of for jackal, so the closest was dog. So it's Castro's dog or the dog of the castle, since that's the jackal of the La Cabaña, the jackal of the castle. When this was first shown in Miami, every few minutes I had to defend myself verbally against somebody. I had this little old guy one time that walked up to me, started taking his jacket off, and he said, "Somebody take this down or I will." And my response to everyone who was very angry at this, because they saw it as idealizing Che, very quickly I learned how to disarm it. I would say, "Why? What's wrong with you? Are you like a big fan of Guevara?" And then they would kind of turn back going, "Well, no, the old guy said, no, that son of a bitch had my brother executed." And then I would explain the whole thing. And then they would kind of get it. The old guy ended up giving me a hug. I had one guy that walked by and asked the gallerist, Sheila Giolitti, he said, "Who did this?" And she started to introduce me, and the guy walked by and went like this, pow, to my head. I had an art critic from the Miami newspaper who said to me, after I explained this to her, she said to me, you better take this down anyway, because somebody's going to take a hammer to this. So it was amazing to me the visceral anger that the piece would still elicit.
So before we open this up to the public, I had one other question, and you may have other things that you both want to say too, but I'm interested in Cuban art today. I'm interested in what this legacy of Korda may have to say for artists in Cuba today. Anything? Or do you think it's a different time and...
I don't know if what you're asking, if Korda had any influence on specifically on photography in Cuba. Certainly, he was a star. The man was a true star. I'll tell you a little story. When he came here to Los Angeles for the first time, it'd be the first time he was ever in the United States since 1960, which is, I think, when he came when Fidel talked at Harvard University. And he was petrified about coming to this country because he only knew about the attacks that could happen on him because of that image. Because you asked me a question also what responsibility he had with that image. It was an enormous honor and it was an enormous burden on him. But he finally arrived. He arrived at Tijuana Airport. Stupid me, I didn't know what anybody in this country knew of Korda or thought of Korda. They knew the image, but Korda. No sooner than we arrived at my house 3 hours later, he stayed there for 2 weeks. It was bedlam, absolute bedlam. My address is not listed, only my friends know where I live. But every hour until 1, 2 in the morning, every single day, there were people knocking at the door because they wanted to see El Maestro. We flew to Minneapolis, and he was a chain smoker too. And and we were sitting in the back row, last row of the plane, and he wanted to smoke. I said, Alberto, you can't smoke. He said, he said, I want to smoke. I said, no, you're going to get arrested. He said, so 20 minutes later, we take off, and he says to me, I have to go pee. I said, okay. So he went out. He went in the bathroom. 5 minutes, he's not back. 10 minutes, he's not back. All of a sudden, the door of the bathroom opened up, and the smoke came spewing out of there. But the flight attendants saw him. They were in the front, and they were laughing because they knew who he was. So it was remarkable. He got away with anything and everything wherever he went. So in a way, it brought an attention on Cuba that there were artists, that there were a photographer in this case who produced something extraordinary in the world. To have a direct influence, though, on photography and contemporary photography today, I don't think so, because the artists today have an entirely different perspective, and their whole approach to photography is very, very different. No, I really can't see the influence that he has had outside of just being the personality that he was, and I think allowing to open a door for artists.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I also work with a contemporary Cuban photographer that does Darrel, and their work is generations and artistic dialogues apart from Korda's work.
Before we open to the public, is there anything else you wanted to say or show on your images, or did we cover it all?
I would like to show the most recent piece, real fast, that I've done on Che. So, I love narrative. This is Che Guevara appropriated from a photograph this time of, and it's called the Real Guevara. It's hard to read. All those quotes in there are Real Guevara quotes. They're racist quotes in some cases. They're anti-Mexican quotes, anti-black quotes. They're anti-gay quotes. They're quotes about how the true revolutionary heart needs to be filled with hate. There are quotes about who cares if on the road to victory there are millions of atomic victims. This is a quote from the Daily Worker in London in an interview during the Cuban crisis. And the subtitle is T-shirt God. And on his forehead is a cutout where a video plays constant rotations of T-shirts. This goes online and is constantly sampling Google for new images on T-shirts. And so it's never the same. It's constantly filling his forehead, how he's lived. So when you log it onto your network at home or wherever it's hanging, and then it's just constantly pulling images from the internet. Another evidence that is more popular than Mona Lisa.
That's a great idea. So let's open it up. Questions? We'll start with you.
I'd like to have you just speak a little more about contrasting Korda's view of photography with a more contemporary photographer. You alluded to it, but could you give us a little more detail on that?
Well, there were two aspects to his photographic life. The first was as a commercial photographer to photograph for print ads, fashion, sometimes print ads for producers of, let's say, tobacco, alcohol products that would appear in magazines. That was in the 50s until 59. And then he became unofficially Fidel's personal photographer. He was never an official photographer of the revolution. In fact, no photographer was an official photographer. It's often misreported that way. There was a very interesting, his approach to photography, though, was, as I said already, was really to present the leaders of the revolution in the best light possible. And that was a carryover from all his work in the 50s in the commercial photography. Because he had a very deep, deep respect for Cuba and the Cubans and the culture and the history. And he wanted that to carry through in the revolution itself. In 1968, just as a point of an interesting shift in his life, Fidel, by then Fidel had stopped any photographers from photographing him. Many of the photographers would accompany him on trips. And in the 70s, Fidel put him underwater. In other words, they gave him a job to document the underwater coastline of Cuba. So there was a whole body of work of color photography that that Korda was very proud of, but really didn't get known or exhibited until maybe 2 years ago in Havana. So this was where he died in 2001. Korda died in 2001. But his influence on photography, his approach to photography, even when he was a photojournalist, I think never really changed from the work that he was doing in the 50s. Interestingly enough, his idol was Richard Avedon. And in 1959, when Fidel was in New York, and first you have an image from that first stop that they made, which was the Fidel in Washington at the Lincoln Memorial. Yeah, I did this one. And you should note that Fidel is the one who put the wreath there. They then went to New York. And Korda, at the time that they were in New York, Raul Castro was in Moscow. Korda took a number of photographs of Fidel in New York. One became quite famous. I think I might even have it here. It's of, in the Bronx Zoo, of Fidel looking at a tiger in a cage. And I remember as a child, I was 10 years old in '59. You can do the math. Just applied for Medicare. How's that going? That's another conversation. No, I don't think I brought it here. But I remember seeing these images and how they transmitted the power of a person all in one image. You know, he was a master at finding that one position that said everything about the person inside. So he never lost that aspect of finding the best, the essence, which actually was a quote he often quoted from the Petit Prince. You know, it's the heart that sees. Huh?
Something hanging out behind Fidel. What is that?
It's his hat. He took his hat off. And do you know where Raul was at this very moment? Raul Castro? He was in Moscow with Khrushchev, hedging their bets.
You talked about the kind of the ideological spectrum of use of the image outside of Cuba. What about inside the country? I mean, you see this plaster all over the place. Is it weird? Is it are people prohibited from using it?
Did everyone hear the question?
It's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole interesting history and story. In fact, if you see Chevolution's documentary, it's something that we sort of go into because it also has to do with copyright issues, which was another problematic thing. It exploded in Cuba. Che is the national hero. Interestingly, you know, Fidel was not very often portrayed in terms of imagery on posters or billboards anywhere, because Fidel did not want his image to become too common, too overseen, whereas Che, no problem. The daughter, Diana Diaz, who owns the copyright to all her father's work, has a constant battle with the Guevara family in Havana. They still live there, the widow and the 4 children, who've been trying to wrest the copyright out of her hands. So they had a bill introduced in Congress 5 years ago to make that image the official image of Cuba, which if it had passed, she would have lost the copyright entirely. They didn't vote for it because Che was not Cuban, he was Argentinian. He didn't stay in Cuba very long. I think Fidel sort of forced him out. That's why he ended up in Bolivia. And there was no reason to have anyone else but Fidel to be the official representative of the revolution, no? So.
You can buy a lot of collateral with Che on it in Cuba.
Thing from toilet paper to glasses, keychain, you name it. The only thing, and on eBay. Okay. The only time I ever saw, and Alberto Korda and I used to travel a fair amount, if he ever saw a bottle of alcohol that had the image on it, it just put him into the ethers because Che never drank. And to associate the image and associate Che with alcohol was a no-no. In fact, it was the first time that Korda sued any company, which was Smirnoff Vodka, for an ad campaign in England, from which he won $50,000 in the settlement, which he donated to Children's Cancer Hospital in Cuba.
Yes, Korda shot actually 2 images of Che on that day. And so I have 2 questions. One is, did Korda print the other image or display it? And did Beltrinelli see the other image?
This print that you see here was done in the year 2000. It is the only time that the second image has ever been printed in this. It was never printed, and the reason is because the vertical one on the bottom, you have this top of the head of a person behind Che, and in those days there was no Photoshop, and he had to print something immediately that night for the news, thinking would be published in the newspaper. So he cropped. He saw the model image, okay, in the top version. Remember, this is 1960. The full frame of that image was never ever printed until 1986, and I'll show you a photo of that very first print in 1986, and you can see the dedication on the bottom with the date on it. So that was the first time the full frame of the famous image was ever printed.
What was Che's relationship, if any, with Korda, and what was Che's opinion of the commercialization of his image, or just the use of his image? Was he in favor, or just ambivalent, or did he care at all?
Korda didn't have much of a relationship with Che. Che didn't like to be photographed because, ironically, Che himself was a photographer. That's how he supported himself in Mexico, where Fidel and Che first met. Actually, in the second motorcycle trip, he took 2. And he was Ernesto Guevara. He wasn't Che Guevara then. It was the Cubans who gave him the nickname Che. He had to flee Bolivia when a revolution began while he was there, and he ended up in Mexico City. So he was always photographing on his motorcycle journeys and began supporting himself in Mexico as a photographer. And he ended up in jail because he was already beginning to try and put together some revolutionary group to start revolutions in South America, particularly in Bolivia. The very top left image is a self-portrait in Mexico City. And the top right is when Fidel was also put in jail, and that's where he met Che Guevara. And because Fidel was a brilliant lawyer, managed to get him out of jail. And that was in July of 1956. And they left in November of 1956 on the boat, the Granma, to go back to start the second attempt at the revolution in Cuba.
While he was in Mexico, one of those, I alluded to some racist quotes, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not remembering the quote exactly, but it's along the lines of one of the reasons he was there was because the Mexicans needed a white person, a white man to lead them because they were nothing but a bunch of lazy Indians. That's a quote from Che Guevara in his early diaries. If you look at his diaries right now, by the way, it's interesting because every time I see a Mexican-American person wearing a Che Guevara thing, I refer him to the diary and give him my email address if they can't find the first edition so that I can Xerox a copy and send it to them because the newest ones have been cleansed. The later one have been completely cleansed of a lot of those racist jokes. Or not jokes, or statements.
At the image, just comment for 1 minute or half a minute. The image at the very bottom was just before Che Guevara fled from Cuba to go to Angola on his way then to Bolivia. He had plastic surgery done. He had chin implants, cheek implants put. His hair shaved, whitened, and he looks like Corleone in The Godfather, because that was the image they used for the passport, so he could get out, silently get out of the country. There's still speculation this day whether Fidel forced him out or asked him to leave. So.
Any other questions? Nick? Yeah? But is she anymore? No? We probably answered those. Great. So I think that we've been focusing so much on this one Che image. And I think before leaving, the show does contain a number of other images, right? And let's not kind of do what everyone else does, which is, you know, only focus on the icon. But there are other images in there, and I'm wondering if the two of you might speak about others that you like in the show.
Actually attracted to the set that shows Che and Fidel playing golf. I just read recently that golf course, or the first golf course, that golf course was long ago closed. A new golf course has been reopened in Havana, I guess for tourists. And there's something about that photograph that really hits the nail on the head about what Darrel was talking about, the ability of Korda to capture that sort of moment in time where he took the context of a revolution with executions and things of that sort. To me, it transmits these two guys that the last thing on the planet, they are golfers, but nonetheless seem to be having fun. And the other one is of Castro skiing, or attempting to ski, and falling down and laughing. For a fraction of a second, I almost liked the guy. But so those photographs, I think, are also able to exemplify what Darrel was trying to say about the way that this man was able to capture those personalities.
There's an amusing story behind those golf photographs. They weren't just that Fidel and Che were playing golf. It's that Fidel had seen in the newspaper in a headline of some American paper of Eisenhower, who had won at a game of golf and got his name in the front page of a newspaper for winning the game. And Fidel was furious because he couldn't even get mention of the revolution in the front page of any newspaper in the States. So apparently he called Che to organize a golf game and invite the press so that they could get their name in a headline for winning a game of golf. Because if you see, I don't remember how many golf images, but in the series, there are some of them where Che is just laughing hysterically at Fidel, who played with, you know, big thick glasses on and could barely hit the ball. But they got his name in the paper.
Okay.
Wonderful images there of Pablo Neruda. Famous authors, and I don't know if there's one of Gabriel Garcia Marquez in the exhibition, but Jean-Paul Sartre, a series that Korda did of authors, famous writers. And you look at them, and look at the human beings behind them. They're not just, you know, passport pictures.
So make sure you look at all the works in the show. And please join me in thanking our wonderful guests.